Hello, everybody. While most Christians thankfully understand the Genesis account of Adam and Eve to be a deep and profound allegorical tale of the cost of sin, of fallenness, of the human condition when we disobey God, there are some Christians who actually believe that the story of Genesis is a literal and historical account of 6 days of creation, where the world was created initially in a state of perfection, and Adam and Eve literally caused the world to fall from perfection by disobeying God and eating a piece of literal fruit from a literal tree in a literal Garden of Eden. Now, I'm going to show by looking at one or two of the Genesis texts why this belief is so absurd that it's astounding that any Christian could swallow it and not consider it more deeply and not know better than to take it literally. Um, I mean, the first thing to say is that Genesis 1 doesn't ever say that creation was perfect. It says creation was good on days 1 to 5, and it says it was very good on day 6 when God created humans. So not only does Genesis never say creation was perfect, as we'll see in a moment, the Adam and Eve story shows it couldn't have been initially perfect either, if you take it literally. Um, when Christians take it hyper literally, they mean that the world created contained no sin or wrongdoing, no suffering or no death, and that these things came into the world because of Adam and Eve's sin. Now, obviously, for the mainstream Christian, none of this makes any sense. The Big Bang is the first instance of the universe as we know it. There's been creation of stars and planets, and life's been evolving on this planet for over 4.5 billion years. And the Genesis story is an allegory that conveys some deep and profound truth. So it's not something that is ever going to be troubling to someone who doesn't take it literally. But for the people who take it hyper literally, the trouble is, if God made a world that contained none of these bad things in it at the beginning, how did it contain the snake in the Garden of Eden to tempt Eve? The snake was deceptive and therefore sinful, yet sin apparently didn't come into the world until after the fall. And presumably there must have been pain or suffering prior to the fall as well, because we're told that Eve's punishment for her disobedience is that God has multiplied her pain in childbirth. Well, to multiply something means it must exist in some sense already. If you have no oranges, you have 0 oranges, and I multiply them by 5, then you still have no oranges because 0 times 5 is still 0. But if you have 1 or 2 oranges and I multiply them by 5, then you have 5 oranges or 10 oranges. But for Eve to have childbirth multiplied, there must have been some pain to begin with, which means there can't have been no suffering or pain before the fall. I'd say in terms of our evolution, we know that pain in childbirth increased because of the size of the cranium increasing. That's why when there was an evolutionary trade-off and intelligence was more important than jaw size and jaw power, our jaws got smaller and our brains got larger, and that's why it became harder for women over time to give birth, and that's why our wisdom teeth are still in dormant in the back of our jaws, and they come through later on to reflect the size of our jaw relative to our brain, and vice versa. So another reason creation couldn't have been perfect from the start is that Genesis 3 says that that when Eve says to the snake, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden," but God said, "You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." And that wasn't, of course, what God said. God never said you mustn't touch it, which means that Eve made an imperfect assessment of God's instruction, meaning creation couldn't have been perfect at that point, because that point was before the fall. As I said, none of this troubles people who don't take it all literally, because we have never believed or have any reason to believe in the myth that God created a perfect world prior to sin. And similarly, some literalists say that it's death which entered the world through Adam's sin. But if that is taken to mean literal death, then that can't be right either, because God tells Adam that if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you shall surely die. Yet we know that later in Genesis, I think it's Genesis 5, Adam is supposed to have lived to 930 years. Now, obviously, I don't take death entering the world or Adam's 930 years literally. But if you're saying you do take it literally, then you have a problem, because Adam did not eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and then die. He lived to 930. And if you think it just means Adam would have lived forever before eating the fruit because he lived in a perfect, unfallen world, then as we've already seen, that isn't the case either. A literal interpretation of Genesis 3 means you have to believe that there was no sin and suffering and death, but through one man's sin, every one of us inherits sin with a capital S. We're under sin. This is another very strange thing to believe for a number of reasons. First, the deception that caused the first sin must have already existed with the snake. So how could sin enter the world through Adam if it already existed in the snake? It couldn't have been Adam who brought sin into the world, because the snake existed. And so with the literal interpretation, it must mean that God brought sin into the world. So literalists are saying, they're asking us to believe that God brought sin into the world through the deceptive snake, causing Adam to sin, which meant we all inherited sin, or the tendency to unavoidably sin, even though we played no part in the original sin. It's like a witch doctor injecting your great-great-grandfather with a virus, which then gets passed down through the line to you and your family, and you're then told that your great-grandfather's to blame, but so are you to blame, and the only way to rectify this problem is to make peace with the witch doctor who injected your great-grandfather with the virus, and ask the witch doctor for forgiveness. It's a very strange thing to believe hyper literally. And with a hyper literal interpretation, it gets even more absurd, because Genesis tells us that God commands Adam not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or he'll die. Then the serpent comes to Eve and says, look, he won't die. So she takes a bite, and then she gives some to Adam. And it's because of that one event in history that sin enters the world. After Eve eats the fruit, God's response is to punish the snake, a snake, by forcing him and his descendants to crawl upon their belly and eat dust for the rest of their lives. He punishes Eve with greater pain in childbirth, as we've already mentioned, and he punishes Adam by making him and all his descendants toil for the rest of their existence in order to eat. Adam and Eve were told not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So presumably this means that prior to eating the fruit, they lived in blissful innocence and did not even know what good and evil were. So the snake came to tempt Eve, but she couldn't have known the snake was deceptive and that his deception was evil because she hadn't yet consumed fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Taken literally, God punishes Adam and Eve for wrongdoing that, according to the literal interpretation of the text, they couldn't have known was wrongdoing. And then God says, because of this, all Adam's descendants are cursed because of it. It's bizarre that people believe this stuff literally. Imagine your first day at school and the head teacher pulls you aside and says, I'm going to make your life miserable at school because your great-great-grandfather went to school here too, and he once committed a terrible act of wrong against, say, the former head teacher. That would be grossly unfair, of course, but it's even worse than that. I mean, imagine your great-grandfather's offense was, I don't know, that the head teacher of the time told him not to flush the toilet because it would flood the whole bathroom, say, and he'll drown. And then the caretaker comes along and says, well, no, that's wrong. The toilet won't flood and make you drown. It will actually flush away into the sewage through the pipe system. So it makes sense to your great-great-grandfather what the caretaker says, and he does flush the toilet. And he finds actually the caretaker was right. Flushing it didn't flood the bathroom and drown him. And yet the past head teacher is so angry that your great-great-grandfather flushed the toilet that he's punishing you and all your family line by making school miserable, even though your great-great-grandfather was technically right to listen to the caretaker because the head teacher wasn't telling the truth. Because Adam ate the fruit, the rest of humankind is cursed, even though Adam didn't die as God said he would. And the snake was the one calling it right on this occasion. Yet everyone after Adam has to suffer because of this. It's absurd boxing yourself in this corner by taking it literally, aside from all the other problems with taking early Genesis literally. As I said, these aren't problems anyone has when they take the Adam and Eve story as it's meant to be taken. It's, as a deep and profound story that conveys profound truths about God and about human nature. My interpretation in Genesis and the fall and Eden and Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Some people think this could be a story about God introducing humans, say, to the concept of morality, but I think it's even deeper than that. We'd already evolved the concept of morality in our human consciousness and our human conscience long before the stories were written. Of course, what God had imparted when He created us in His image was the awareness of ourselves in relation to God's higher standard. Adam and Eve must have already had the idea of right and wrong before they took the fruit in order to know they were not supposed to take the fruit. Even the idea that they should obey God's instruction as to which trees they could eat from, it still involves a value judgment that isn't, morally neutral. And they would have known, say, from God's instruction that, I don't know, that dying is worse than not dying. And as I said, that obeying God is superior to disobeying God. Those realizations could only be apprehended with an already existent ability to make value judgments. When God said you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree that they should have avoided was the tree that brought the law, but also the chance to choose self over God. In 2 Corinthians 3:6, Paul refers to the realization as the letter that kills and the spirit. It's the letter that kills and the spirit that gives life. And I think a remarkably deep thing is being conveyed in this story, a profundity that probably takes a lifetime to unpack. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is both, in a sense, it's both the chicken of moral revelation and the egg of conceptual fallenness. It runs both backwards and forwards. I think it shows us who we really are in relation to God. It compels us to use that knowledge to act as though we are more than just moral beings, and it invites us to come to God for salvation. Taking it absolutely literally and absolutely historically means believing a ridiculous story that God created a world with innocent Adam and Eve, but introduced a snake to tempt them to eat fruit from a tree they were wrongly told would cause their death, which the snake turned out to be right about, and caused a sin that would be inherited by everyone else who lived after them, from which only God himself can save us. It's like an engineer creating a man and a woman to live innocently on an island of paradise, and then introducing a virus to infect them so we could come onto the island and inject them with the antidote they wouldn't otherwise have needed. Taking it literally implies that humanity could have remained in paradise if Adam and Eve had only eaten from the trees God allowed, and yet God introduced a deceptive snake to get them to eat from the tree he didn't want them to eat from, thereby denying them the life of paradise in which they already lived. Again, this isn't a problem. The whole list of absurdities I mentioned isn't a problem if you take it correctly. It's only a problem if you falsely believe that God initially created a perfect world and that the Adam and Eve story is literal and historically true and not a profound allegory as it's clearly meant to be taken. So I hope that clears things up a little bit. Thank you for listening and good night. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy my stuff. It all helps to build up a profile, and you can click on my blog link in the description below. Thank you very much. Good night.